I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mother sat across from me at the kitchen table, a calm but insistent expression on her face, as though she were discussing something as mundane as the weather. But her words hit me like a freight train. "I think it would mean so much to Greg if he walked you down the aisle," she had said, her voice sweet, almost persuasive. Greg, her new husband, the man she'd married less than 2 years ago, barely old enough to be my older brother, let alone someone I would consider a father figure. My real father, my biological dad, the man who had raised me, was still very much alive and eager to be part of my big day. Her suggestion wasn't just out of line. It was outrageous. My father and I had always been close. He had been my rock through the chaos of my parents' divorce, offering stability when everything else was crumbling. He was the one who had taught me to ride a bike, who had cheered the loudest at my high school graduation, who had stood by me no matter what. And now, my mother wanted to push him aside for Greg, for a man I barely knew? At first, I thought it was a joke, a poorly timed and tasteless attempt at humor. But as she stared at me, waiting for my response, I realized she was entirely serious. "Absolutely not," I said, my voice trembling with restrained anger. "Dad is walking me down the aisle. That's not up for debate." Her reaction was immediate. Her face darkened, and the warmth in her tone evaporated. "I think you're being incredibly selfish," she snapped, her earlier charm replaced with icy irritation. "Greg has done so much for this family, and you can't even show him a little gratitude?" Gratitude? For what? For swooping in with his flashy smile and superficial charm. For turning my mother's head and pulling her into his orbit so completely that she had started rewriting history? My family wasn't his, and my wedding wasn't an opportunity to prop up his fragile ego. The argument spiraled from there, turning uglier with every exchange. My mother accused me of being ungrateful, of clinging to the past, of failing to accept Greg as part of the family. I shot back that Greg wasn't my family, that he was her husband, not my father, and that she was the one being selfish by trying to force this on me. By the time I left her house that day, our relationship felt more fractured than ever before. The weeks leading up to my wedding were supposed to be a time of joy and excitement. Instead, they were overshadowed by the fallout from that conversation. My mother stopped calling, stopped texting, and when I reached out, she responded with cold indifference or not at all. She was clearly trying to punish me for not giving in to her demand, and it hurt more than I cared to admit. I confided in my fiancé, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions. Part of me hoped my mother would come around, that she would realize how unreasonable she was being and show up to celebrate my big day. But as the date approached, it became increasingly clear that she was digging in her heels. I heard through family members that she had told them she wouldn't be attending. "If she doesn't respect Greg, then I don't see why I should support her," she had reportedly said. Her words stung, not just for their cruelty, but for the sheer absurdity of the situation. This was my wedding, my moment, and she was willing to miss it over a manufactured slight against a man she had known for less time than it takes some people to finish college. On the day of the wedding, my father was the one who helped calm my nerves. He stood by me as I prepared to walk down the aisle, his presence steady and reassuring. When the doors opened, and I saw my fiancée waiting for me at the end of the aisle, my heart swelled with love and gratitude. The absence of my mother, though painful, no longer felt like the defining moment of the day. This was about me, my husband, and the life we were starting together. After the ceremony, as we celebrated with friends and family, I couldn't help but notice the empty chair that should have been hers. Part of me wanted to cry, to mourn the loss of the relationship we once had. But another part of me felt a sense of clarity. My mother had made her choice. She had chosen Greg, her pride, and her need for control over her relationship with me. In the weeks that followed, I learned just how far my mother was willing to go to make her point. She stopped answering my calls altogether and blocked me on social media. When I sent her pictures from the wedding, they were returned unopened. It was as if she had decided to erase me from her life entirely. And maybe, in her mind, she had. It wasn't easy to come to terms with her absence. There were moments when I doubted myself, wondering if I should have given in, if I should have let Greg walk me down the aisle just to keep the peace. But deep down, I knew I had made the right choice. I had stood up for my father, for myself, and for what I believed in, and no amount of manipulation or guilt could take that away from me. Eventually, I decided to move on. My mother had drawn her line in the sand, and I couldn't keep chasing after someone who refused to meet me halfway. I focused on my new life with my husband, on building a future filled with love, honesty, and mutual respect. My mother's absence was a loss, but it was also a lesson, a painful reminder that sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who let you down the hardest. Here's a more expanded continuation. Months went by, and while life moved forward, I couldn't escape the heavy shadow of my mother's absence. At times, it felt like a dull ache, a reminder that some wounds don't heal as quickly as others. The wedding had been a bittersweet moment, one where joy and sadness mingled together. The love and laughter I shared with my husband, friends, and the family who did show up gave me strength. But there was always that lingering absence, like a picture missing from a frame. I tried to focus on building my life with my husband. We threw ourselves into the routine of newlywed life, working on projects around our small home, planning weekend getaways, and dreaming of a future that, someday, might include children. My husband was my rock, patient and understanding when grief would sneak up on me. He didn't say much about my mother's betrayal. He let me process it on my terms. My father was my biggest source of comfort. After years of feeling like I was always caught between my parents, his unwavering support was something I clung to. He would call me every weekend, just to check in, even when there wasn't much to say. "How's my favorite newlywed?" he'd ask in his warm, teasing tone. For the first time, I felt like I didn't have to fight for his attention. He was fully present, fully in my corner. It was bittersweet, knowing that losing my mother's presence had strengthened my bond with my father. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if my mother thought of me. Did she regret missing my wedding? Did she realize how deeply her actions had hurt me? Or had she convinced herself that she was the wronged party? These questions haunted me during quiet moments, when I wasn't distracted by work or chores or the simple pleasures of life with my husband. One day, I got a call from my aunt, my mother's sister. She rarely reached out to me, so I was surprised to see her name on my phone screen. Her voice was laced with concern as she explained why she was calling. "Your mom's not doing so great," she said cautiously, as if testing the waters. "She hasn't said much, but I know things with Greg are strained." Strained. It was the word people used when they didn't want to say what they really meant. According to my aunt, Greg's business was struggling, and their finances were in shambles. My mother had been leaning on family for support, but her pride wouldn't allow her to admit how bad things had gotten. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me felt vindicated. She had thrown away her relationship with me for this man, and now she was reaping the consequences of that choice. But another part of me, the part that still longed for my mother's love, felt a pang of guilt. I had always been the type to try to fix things, to make peace, even when I wasn't the one at fault. After that call, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I wondered if she felt regret, or if she still blamed me for everything. Did she see me as a rebellious daughter who had refused to honor her wishes, or as someone who had simply stood up for herself? The questions gnawed at me, and I knew I couldn't carry them around forever. A few weeks later, I decided to write her a letter. It wasn't easy. Every word felt like a tightrope walk between vulnerability and self-preservation. I told her how deeply she had hurt me by skipping my wedding, by choosing Greg's ego over her role as my mother. I explained that while I understood her desire to make Greg feel included, there were boundaries that should never have been crossed. But I didn't stop there. I also told her that I missed her, that I wanted her in my life. Despite everything, I wrote about the happy moments we had shared before Greg came into the picture, how she used to sing along to the radio while cooking dinner, how she helped me pick out my prom dress, how she hugged me so tightly the day I left for college. I wanted her to know that those memories still mattered to me, even if the present felt broken. At the end of the letter, I left the door open. I told her that if she wanted to rebuild our relationship, I was willing to try, but it had to be on equal terms. I wouldn't compromise my boundaries or allow Greg's presence to dictate our dynamic. I mailed the letter and waited. Days turned into weeks, and there was no response. I told myself not to expect anything, but the silence still stung. My life moved on. I celebrated my first wedding anniversary, started a new project at work, and spent more weekends with my dad. But every time I checked the mail, a small part of me hoped to see her handwriting on an envelope. Then, one afternoon, it came. It wasn't a letter, but a card. Inside, she had written a simple message: "I'm sorry for everything. I miss you. Can we talk?" The words hit me like a wave. It wasn't the grand apology I had dreamed of, but it was something, a crack in the wall that had grown between us. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I had to try. The first conversation we had was awkward and strained. She admitted that she had felt hurt and rejected when I refused to let Greg walk me down the aisle. But she also acknowledged that she hadn't handled it well. She didn't go into detail about her struggles with Greg, but it was clear that their relationship wasn't as perfect as she had once portrayed. Rebuilding our relationship wasn't easy. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, and I had to remind myself why I had set boundaries in the first place. But over time, we found a new rhythm. She began to call me more often, asking about my life and showing genuine interest in my happiness. I visited her occasionally, Though I kept my interactions with Greg polite but distant. I wish I could say that everything went back to the way it was. But that wouldn't be true. Our relationship will always carry the scars of what happened. But I've learned that healing doesn't mean erasing the pain. It means finding a way to move forward despite it. In the end, I'm grateful for the progress we've made. My mother and I will never have the perfect bond, but we have something better than what we had before. A mutual understanding of each other's flaws and a willingness to keep trying. Sometimes, that's all you can ask for.